Hi boys, Miss Quance here. So I am going to go through our races responses again, but we're going to look at the text, the invention of the telephone that began with Alexander Graham Bell's dog. So I know that we touched on inventions within the last week and how inventions can be purposeful, that they serve a purpose and a reason. So what we're going to do is I already have some details that I went through and I highlighted for us to help answer our question response. And right here, we're going to do a races question response to support our answer right below. So here it says, the story of the telephone begins with a dog named Truve. The dog's owner was Alexander Graham Bell. He lived more than 100 years ago. When Bell was 20 years old, his father asked him if he thought he could make a talking machine. Bell turned to his dog Truve for help. So talking machine. He's thinking, his father asked him about a talking machine. That might be an important detail. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to annotate that. Remember, highlight, and then the annotations pop up here, and then we pick a color on the side. Bell put some delicious food near the dog. Then he moved Truve's mouth as the dog cried out for the food. By changing the shape of the dog's mouth, Bell changed the sounds. Bell moved Truve's mouth so perfectly he made the dog talk. "How are you, Grandmama?" Truve said. The story might seem a bit strange, but this moment set Bell on the path to inventing the telephone. So right here, they're mentioning this part of the story helps us to understand that Bell was on the path to invent the telephone. We're going to highlight that part. How sound travels. Sound travels through the air in waves. When someone talks, these sound waves travel from speaker to listener. Okay, so when someone talks, we know that the waves from a speaker to a listener, then the waves make our eardrum vibrate or move back and forth. I'll put that in yellow. The eardrum is a thin sheet inside each ear. The vibrations in our eardrums are not just noise. We hear certain vibrations as certain sounds. Bell had an idea. Maybe sound could travel through a wire instead of the air. Electricity could carry sound through a wire to a receiver. Sound waves carried through a wire would make the receiver vibrate. So I already highlighted those parts. So those are key details, talking about our inventions. These vibrations would make the listener's eardrum vibrate too. Maybe the listener would hear these vibrations as sounds. Message received. Bell and his helper Thomas Watson began an experiment. The two set up receivers in separate rooms. The receivers were connected by a wire. Bell went to one room, Watson went to the other. Then it happened, almost like magic. Bell spoke, and on his receiver, Watson heard, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want you." Bell's invention worked. It would soon change the world. Just 30 years later, millions of telephones were being used. So now I have the details below that I highlighted, which talks about our most modern or up-to-date phones that are available, and they're known as smartphones. So you guys might know of smartphones through Apple products or Android products, and they are more advanced with certain applications and things that we're able to do. So even on our smartphones now, we're able to even access NewsELA. There's NewsELA apps that you can access. There's Zoom that you can access on a cell phone, on a smartphone. So they have changed or evolved over time. So these days, people line up for Apple's latest iPhone. iPhone's a common smartphone. Smartphones certainly get fancier and fancier. Still, they're just the latest form of Bell's great invention. Maybe iPhone fans should thank Truve the Terrier. Without him, there might be no phones at all. So, We're going to go to the writing prompts as we see right here. What does this passage tell us about how the telephone was invented? Use races to support your answer. So, remember our R. Our R stands for restate. So, we're going to cross out the question words. Remember, we take out what, and we're taking out does. What does? We don't need that. So we're going to say, this passage tells us that what? So now we want our A. And remember, our A is our answer. So our answer could be what? Let's look into the text. This tells us about how does this tell us about how the telephone was invented? So let's go here. Tells us that I like this detail. Sound waves. Sound waves carried through a wire would make the receiver vibrate. So this passage tells us that telephones were invented through wires that carried sound waves. So this passage tells us that telephones are invented through wires that carried sound waves. So we have our R, we restated the question. Now we have our A. We talked about how it was invented. So it was invented through wires that carried sound waves. Now we need our C, and remember the C2. So C2, I'm going to put a 2 here so we just remember that. C2, so we're citing 2 pieces of evidence, 2 details. Remember our starter sentences that we would use for this. So the starter sentence 1 is, I know this because in the text it says, remember those quotations I'm taking. When we take something directly from the text, we start with that quotation. So it says, electricity could carry sound through a wire to a receiver. Remember, I put a period and then I put the quotations after the period. That means I took it directly from the text and I ended it from the period and I put the quotations after that period. So remember, that's part of our grammar that we work on. Also, the text states, you could say or says. So also the text says, we'll actually use the word says. And let's take this green annotation that I did. Sound waves carried through a wire would make the receiver vibrate. Period, end quotations. So right here I have my C2, I have my 2 pieces of details that tell me how the telephone was invented. So now I need my E and then my S. So I need to explain and sum this up. So we can start out with this tells us, what, boys? That phones were invented through sound waves carried by wires. We can also mention the purpose. So a purpose, when we think of a purpose for the phone, Because when we talk about inventions, we want to think of it having a purpose or an actual reason. So a purpose of it that we can look at is that it helps us communicate with each other. And now, as technology is growing, they went from regular phones, household phones, to now we're going into smartphones. It's making communication faster, easier, and more effective. We go from smartphones as a regular phone. If you think on a house phone, back, I know even when I was growing up, when I was your age, there were phones that had wires that were plugged in for house phones that I would see. And now there are so many cell phones, which we could go outside, we could go for a walk, we could go to the park, and we could still have our phones to communicate to those around us. Rather, when you're home with the older phones, that type of communication was used at the house. So the purpose of the phone, we can write, for summing it up, as phones help people communicate faster and easier. We see that here. So now I have my E and my S, and this is my written response. So I hope this video helps us when we're writing our races responses, and especially with the C2. Many of us, we need to go back. We need to use C2. We need those 2 pieces of evidence from the text. So go in, annotate your text, either on NewsELA or in your packets, and use it to apply to the races responses.